Hi there. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm not seeing anyone joining yet, but I hope you are. Going to put the description in the box. There you go. Ah, Derek, I see you. Okay, great. Thank you for joining. So anyhow, I think you're the only one here so far, Derek. But I'm expecting several other people, so we'll see. We'll see. This is something new for me. It's the first time I'm actually doing this, hopefully right, so we'll see. So Derek, where are you coming in from? Oh, and Kartik. I'm seeing Kartik. I hope I'm saying that right. I'll be starting in just a few minutes, but I thought I'd wait for a few more people. It's not quite 8 o'clock yet, at least not by my computer clock, so we'll see. Okay, there's a comment, but I'm not seeing it. Let me see if I can click on it and see it. Oh, I'm going to turn my Outlook program off. Someone sent a comment, but it's not showing up. It's Derek's comment, evidently. Not sure why it's not letting me see it. I'm going to open it up in another tab and hopefully, there we go. Okay. Not sure why it's not letting me see it. I'm going to open it up in another tab and hopefully, there we go. Okay. Not sure why it's not letting me see it. I'm going to open. Okay. I see more comments coming, but for some reason oh, there we go. Okay, now they're coming in. I'm not quite sure why. It took a little while, but it has. Oh, Raleigh, North Carolina. Yes, I was in Charlotte for several years. It really was great. And Steve, I've got you and Derek and Lillian and Kartik. So this is great. Okay. So I'm going to just give people a few minutes to get on because I actually meant to be on a little sooner and I wasn't, so I was still fooling with the settings. So we'll give everyone a chance to get on, just a few minutes, and then I'll get started. Oh, I see some other people joining us now. All right, great, okay. I'm going to give it another 2 minutes and then we'll get started. And what you're seeing in the background is my office, where I spend most of my time. And it's really good to have you all here because I've been writing a new book and it's kept me very isolated. Writing is a solitary type of event, so it's really good to be able to connect with you all this way. Yes, actually, I did invite people on my Facebook page, but we got started a little late, and I didn't want to do too much of advertising because this is my first time doing something like this. I wanted to see and make sure that I knew what I was doing because we actually, myself and someone else, tried this the other day and we weren't able to connect, and that wasn't that wasn't very good. So I wanted to be sure we had this right. So I'm going to just leave 1 more minute for people to join, and then I'm going to get started because I appreciate you all being here on time, and I don't want to keep you longer than you want to be kept, but I'm going to try really hard to answer all your questions. And I see some other people coming in as well. And James, okay, I see you. Oh, I'm seeing many more people coming in, but I'm not sure all the names are coming up. I'm seeing a lot of smiley faces. So if you have a comment, you know you can just type it in the side box, and hopefully I'll see it. All right. Well, it's 8:03 by my computer clock, so I'm going to go ahead and do a short introduction. I'm Mary Ruwart, and I'm the author of a number of libertarian books. Healing Our World is probably my best known book, and then Short Answers to the Tough Questions, and the one that's going to be released on April 10th is Death by Regulation: How We Were Robbed of a Golden Age of Health and How We Can Reclaim It. I've been active in the libertarian movement since, well, for a long time, let's just say that. And I've run for office many times. I served on the LNC. Many of you probably know that in 2008, I ran against Bob Barr for the presidential nomination. And I've just done a lot of different things, but I'm best known as a writer. So that's the brief introduction about me. And now I'd like to tell you a little bit about Death by Regulation, because I think it's going to be, I believe, an important book, or I wouldn't have spent years writing it. And as I mentioned earlier to some of the people who came in early, writing that book kept me very isolated for a long time, just because there was a lot of work involved in it. A lot of review of the literature, calculations, things like that. So I appreciate y'all being here tonight, because I had to kind of cut back on my social interaction to get this book out. And it feels really good to be here with you in this way as a start of kind of getting back into the social swing of things. So thank you for coming. So Death by Regulation has a lot to do with the fact that I've been involved in prevention and treatment of disease most of my career. So let's talk about prevention for a moment. You know, when I was a researcher back in the late 1970s and beyond, shall we say, we didn't have all the genetic manipulation techniques that we have today. So we had these very healthy rats that we had to work on to make sick. And the only way we could make them sick, actually, was to take away their vitamins or really change their nutrient mix so that they were overwhelmed with carbohydrates or overwhelmed with fats, things of this nature. And of course, we saw a disease that looked very similar to what happened in people. But most people don't realize that optimal nutrition is really important, because in 1962, there were amendments passed to the Food and Drug Act that really empowered the FDA, and it really censored a lot of this information. In fact, even though I'm able to calculate roughly how many people have lost their lives due to the impact of the amendments on the pharmaceutical industry, I can't really get a good fix on the number of people who have died because of the information that's been censored by the FDA. But I believe it is much larger than the numbers I'm going to tell you about the drug industry. So these 62 amendments really shifted our medical paradigm from inexpensive prevention to expensive treatment, and probably killed a lot of people in the process. Now, on the pharmaceutical industry, it changed the amount of time it took for a drug, even a life-saving drug, to get from the lab bench to the marketplace. It used to be 4 years before 1962. But these amendments empowered the FDA in such a way that every year the regulations get more and more. And so what happens is it took the development time from 4 to 14 years by the end of the last century. And a lot of people die waiting. If you saw Dallas Buyers Club, you saw how the AIDS patients tried to save themselves with drugs from other countries, and they actually hired black market chemists to make the same ones we were working on in the pharmaceutical industry. And And by the time the FDA finally gave us permission to put drugs in people, every AIDS patient in the country who wanted the drugs already had them and were resistant to them. So we had to wait for new patients to be diagnosed with AIDS to do the testing that the FDA required. So these delays are very crucial. A lot of people, about 15 million, according to my calculations, since 1962 have died waiting. That's more than 10 times the number of Americans who have died in all of our wars. And what's happened to innovation is it's been slashed. At least 50% of our drugs drop out in late phase testing. But actually, the number of innovative products are really slashed by much more than that, probably about 80%. When I was working in the pharmaceutical industry, one of the FDA examiners called me up and said, Dr. Ruwart, I understand you have applied for a patent for prostaglandins and liver disease. Prostaglandins are a natural substance. Your body, every cell in your body makes them. And it turns out if you have the right kind of prostaglandins, you can really improve your health. And when you take fish oil today, what you're doing is you are trying to get your body to build the good prostaglandins. So even with the FDA's support, though, we really couldn't develop prostaglandins for liver disease, because when you have something that's really new, you don't know what dose to give, how long you have to give it, how many patients you need to get the statistical significance that the FDA wants, and you don't know, for example, how long you need to treat. Liver disease builds up over a series of years and probably has to be treated over a series of years. And one of the big problems that we have is that we don't know if our studies are going to work the way we think they are exactly. And if we don't get the statistical significance that the FDA wants, we have to start over again. And the problem with that is by the time a new drug would come to market, it would go generic the first day that it was on the market, and there would be no recovery of the development costs. So I estimate conservatively, by the way, that 26.7 million people have died because of the loss of such innovations. And this means that half the people who have died since 1962 of disease have lost about 10 years of their lives to the amendments. That's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is we've all lost 5 years of our lives because of these amendments. These are probably the most deadly regulations that have ever been passed. So I'm bringing this to the attention of the American public because most people think that regulations protect them, when in fact they often do just the opposite. So that's one of the messages of death by regulation. And of course I go into what I think we need to fix it as well. Now, because the book won't be available until April 10th, I'm trying to encourage people to buy it in advance. And to do that, I'm offering about $60 worth of free gifts when you order before April 9th. On April 10th, when we put the book on Amazon, we're going to put all the orders in at once and hopefully get the book on the Amazon bestseller list, because then Amazon will promote it as well. And most of you are libertarian or libertarian leaning, and you know how important it is to educate the American public about the fact that bad regulations can have side effects that are just as deadly as bad drugs. And if you want to go and learn more about the book and buy it and get your free gifts, you can go to deathbyregulation.us. That's deathbyregulation.us. And I hope you'll do that. My website, by the way, is ruwart.com, ruwart.com, just like I spell my name. And you can go there and also read some blog posts on the book. And you can also go to my free library and get lots of really great downloads. So I'm going to stop for a moment and just look at the questions and everything that people have been sending, so that if I can, I am going to answer questions. Oh, Kyle Varner's on. He says he's already pre-ordered his copy. Thanks, Kyle. I really appreciate it. And Joanne says the FDA regulations are so expensive that only products with patents can justify that expense. And that's true. You know, when I first joined the Upjohn company, we developed drugs that didn't have patents. But one of the things I didn't mention, and it's very important, is that the regulatory costs are going up every single year. It's exponential. It's not even linear. And so what's happening is, as more time goes on, drug companies really find themselves in a position where not only can they not develop drugs that don't have patents, they can't even develop drugs that are only given for a few weeks. They focus on drugs that are given for a lifetime. And that's what makes them dangerous, because your body can handle something for a couple of weeks. But a couple decades, that's a different story. So even if the drug is safer, which the drugs post-amendment are not. That's another thing that I show in the book, is that the safety hasn't improved. And actually, it's kind of gotten worse because drug companies can only focus on drugs that you take for decades. And that's a very dangerous thing to do. And that's why prevention is so important, and why I led with that, because, you know, obviously, that's something that we all need to focus on. Eventually, prevention will fail. We're all going to die of something, right? But, you know, as long as we can, we want to put off the inevitable. Let me look and check some more comments here. Yes, I'm being asked by Kevin how these regulations affect Canadians. And actually, they affect everyone in the world. And the reason is that most new drugs are developed in the United States. So if we're suppressing innovation in the United States, that means we're suppressing the drugs that would go out into the world from the US. And also, unfortunately, most other countries try to imitate the US Food and Drug Administration. In fact, there is a movement afoot to harmonize all of the regulations, which translates to, let's make them as strict as the United States. And if that happens, it's going to be very difficult. In fact, some countries like Germany are even more restrictive right now. In Germany, if you want to take a gram of vitamin C, you need a prescription. That's crazy. And Kyle's asking me, how would I see drug development without patents? Well, I think if the 1962 amendments had not been passed, I think a lot of the things we call drugs today would actually be vitamins and other nutritional products. The reason I say that is, although this isn't known to a lot of people who practice prevention and enjoy taking supplements, the big pharma companies were actually very invested in nutrition before 1962. For example, Upjohn had its Unicaps, other Unicaps, which were multivitamins. They were low-dose multivitamins by our standards. They were just the recommended daily allowances, or the minimal daily allowances. But they were very interested in nutrition because only the pharmaceutical companies really were in a position to manufacture these things. You know, we didn't, until about the 1960s, late 1950s, early 60s, we really didn't have a lot of vitamin manufacture. But just before the amendments were passed, the pharmaceutical industry was gearing up and was actually manufacturing all of these things. And in fact, most companies that get vitamin C to put in their capsules, or many of the other nutrients like vitamin E, actually still get them from the pharmaceutical companies because they have the manufacturing equipment. So what I think would have happened without the 62 amendments is the pharmaceutical companies would have been very happy to put a nutrient on the market for treating disease, and not putting a molecule that had to be manipulated, which is what is done to get patents. Of course, there's other reasons to manipulate it, to make it last in the body longer so that you only have to take one a day instead of 5, things like that. But I really think we would have had a lot more prevention. And this is the big problem, in my opinion, with these amendments. Okay, so Derek's asking, should cannabis be available in Walmart over the counter without prescription? Well, as we can see from the states that have legalized medical marijuana or even recreational marijuana, it's not a problem. And, you know, it's a lot of people actually, in the studies I've seen, have found out, for example, that auto accidents go down. And the reason is that if you are drinking alcohol, you get more aggressive. But if you're taking cannabis, you tend to move slower and drive slower. And a lot of people are switching from alcohol to cannabis in the states that allow it. So I think, yes, I gave you a long answer, but the answer is yes. And then Joanne is asking, do I think the drug industry could be related the same way that UL provided regulation for the electrical industry? And the short answer is yes. I mean, I actually propose that somewhat in my book. But for those of you who aren't familiar with UL, it is the certifier of electrical appliances. And by certifier, what I mean is that the UL gives its seal of approval to products that it believes are safe. And if the manufacturer's given them something that isn't safe, UL tries to work with them to make it safe. And so the thing that's different between certifiers and regulators is if a regulator says, you know, you can't market this drug or this product, you know, that it's not available to you. A certifier is really only making a recommendation. But even though it's only a recommendation, most places won't sell electrical appliances that don't have the UL certification or some other equivalent certification. And that's, of course, because they don't want their customers getting electrocuted, which makes sense. Also, I just wanted to point out that there are consumer groups who are doing an excellent job of discovering which drugs are going to be effective years before the FDA actually approves them. I'm thinking now of the, I'm drawing a blank here. That'll come back to me. Let me talk about the best pills and worst pills that Public Citizen puts out. They evaluate which pills should be withdrawn from the market, and they've made that recommendation on many different pills, so that about 50% of the recommended withdrawals actually happen. And the Abigail Alliance, which is the group I kind of was drawing a blank on earlier, has actually recommended the more rapid approval of 40 anti-cancer drugs. And those drugs have actually eventually been approved and found to be very helpful for cancer patients. But cancer patients had to wait on the average 2 or 3 extra years for the FDA to approve them after the studies basically already showed enough information that a consumer group was able to tell that they should be approved. So, you know, with the internet today, it's actually not difficult for those who really want to learn about a drug and evaluate the studies to do so. We haven't had that in the past. This used to all be a secret, how long things got delayed, but it isn't any longer with the internet. So Canadians for Liberty is asking me, what can Canada and the US do if they were willing to follow my advice? Well, one thing, unfortunately, in the US, I don't know that this has happened in Canada, but the FDA is very fond of taking people to court. And it does that because then it can get a court ruling that backs it up. So, for example, one of the court rulings is that any food or nutrient that has a manufacturer that makes a claim that that food or nutrient can treat or prevent disease is automatically turned into a drug. In other words, walnuts, cherries, vitamins have all been deemed to be drugs by the FDA. And if these foods and nutrients have manufacturers who want to make claims about the health benefits, they have to jump through all these regulatory hoops that drugs do. But of course they aren't going to, because they'd never recover their development costs. So one of the things that both the US and Canadians need to think about is not only repealing the 1962 amendments and whatever the equivalent is in Canada, but they need to be looking at these court cases. And in the US, it's so hopeless. What I am recommending is that in the US, you no longer need FDA approval to market drugs and to rely on certifications for safety. And one of the things I suggest is that we turn the FDA into a certifying organization, not because I think it'll make a great certifying organization, but because I think it's a way to get 2 tracks going. And with these 2 tracks, people will get to make their own choice, as they should, because it's their body, right? It should be their choice. They get to decide at what stage of development they want to take a drug. It won't be against the law for them to take a drug to try to save their lives anymore. And so if they want to do that, they can. And if they want to wait for the FDA's blessing, for the FDA to say, yeah, we think this is a good drug, people who want to wait for that can do that too. So everybody gets what they want. I think that's the way to handle it. And Derek asked, should the FDA be defunded? In an ideal world, in my book, I'm just focusing, of course, on the 1962 amendments, because I want to show that these regulations are not only the most deadly regulations we've ever passed, but I want to show how bad regulations can be. Because obviously the American public thinks regulations are good, and they backfire every time. So even though I personally would like to see the FDA defunded or done away with, I didn't make that recommendation in the book because I didn't make the case for it. I just made the case for the way drug approvals are handled. So, and of course, not only that, but the way that we shifted from prevention to treatment because of these amendments. So we need to do away with the impact of the amendments. And because of the court cases, the only way we can do that is to no longer make it necessary for drugs to have FDA approval to be marketed. That also changes the whole dynamics with prevention, because now the FDA can't say, oh, well, you can't make this claim for this nutrient or for your cherries or walnuts, because they have no basis any longer. Yes, Joanne says, make the FDA advisory, not dictatorial. I certainly agree. Oh, and Rick, yes, hi. So I think I've answered everyone's questions, but if I haven't, please feel free to write in the comments section. Oh, okay, Kyle's asking me to talk about folic acid. Yes, this is one of the examples of how prevention is thwarted by these amendments. So back in the early 1980s, we knew that folic acid, which is a B vitamin, could prevent almost 100% neural tube defects, which are birth defects that are very, very devastating. Most children with neural tube defects have to be institutionalized. And the folic acid manufacturers, of course, wanted to advertise this because young women needed to take folic acid in the first month or two that they were pregnant. So, usually they don't know then, right? So all women of childbearing potential probably should have been taking folic acid. But the FDA told them, the folic acid manufacturers, that if they tried to advertise this, that they would be shut down. And the reason is because they were making a claim of prevention of disease. When the Center for Disease Control, another government agency, started saying that women of childbearing potential should take folic acid, the FDA told the folic acid manufacturers that if they even mentioned that the CDC was doing this, that they would be shut down. So basically, about 12 years went by before most young women learned that they should be taking folic acid, even if their intent wasn't to get pregnant, so that they would avoid the possibility of these horrible birth defects. And so what happened in the US is that probably somewhere between 10 to 15,000 babies were born needlessly with these defects. And many more were aborted because this is one of the things we test for in utero. So this is very sad. And the reason it's so sad and contradictory is the 1962 amendments were passed to prevent the same kind of tragedy that Europe experienced with thalidomide. Thalidomide was a safer sleeping drug, and what happened when pregnant women took it, they found out that it helped their morning sickness, so the manufacturers started marketing it for that. Unfortunately, even though it was very safe for adults, it was not so safe for babies, and so many of these children were born with missing limbs, or they died shortly after birth. And this happened mostly in Europe because the drug hadn't been approved in the US. But even though it wasn't a problem in the US, the alarm that was triggered in the US was great enough that Congress actually passed these 1962 amendments, which had been floating around in Congress for years, and they hadn't been adopted because it was pretty clear they were bad law, but they got adopted in the midst of this crisis because that's how Congress felt they could reassure the American people. And of course, these regulations have backfired. And part of the reason that happened was that back in the early 60s, we didn't appreciate in the way we do today how sensitive the fetus was to drugs that were safe for the mother. And most of the safety problems that we have even today are ones where we really have trouble predicting the outcome because we just don't know enough. That's what most of the safety problems are. The rate at which we withdraw drugs from the market after they're approved actually went up slightly after the amendments. It was about 2.6% of all drugs pre-amendment and something like 3.2 or 3.3 after the amendments. Those numbers probably aren't different, but as you can see, drugs didn't get safer after the amendments. So, you know, there's no safety benefits to these amendments in spite of all the extra testing. And the reason, again, is that we just don't know enough sometimes to know if a drug is going to be safe or not. And of course, no drug is safe for everyone. And no drug is effective for everyone. So to ask that we make sure, as we do, we have this expectation that the FDA is only going to approve safe and effective drugs. And if it did that, it wouldn't be approving any drugs at all. So it does the next best thing. It demands many, many studies. So if Congress is told about some of the side effects and Congress gets on the FDA's back, which it frequently does, at least the FDA feels they can show their due diligence. You know, we asked for 14 years of studies. What do you expect? So it's sad because everybody loses. I mean, if you think about it, it doesn't matter if you're a pharmaceutical executive, a regulator, if you're a patient, a doctor. We're all losing years of our lives because we don't have the proper nutrition and prevention, and we don't have the best drugs that we could have, and they don't get to the market fast enough. And that's all because of the amendments. So everybody suffers. And that's why I am somewhat hopeful that this book will have a big impact, because when people who think they profit by these regulations see what it's really costing them in years of their lives, maybe they'll think differently. And Brian says, thank you for spreading your message. Thank you, Brian. This book really took a lot out of me, I have to tell you. So I really appreciate that you're here tonight, and I appreciate that you will hopefully go to deathbyregulation.us and look over the material, and if you feel moved, please buy a book in the pre-sale, get your $60 worth of free gifts, and help us make it an Amazon bestseller so the message gets out, because that's what's important. Let me see if I have other comments. Okay. I'm not seeing anything else, but I'm open for suggestion. I'll answer your questions. Yes, Jay says he heard about the folic acid and birth defects in the early 90s in South Texas. Yes, it was all over. And it was so unnecessary. That's what's sad. And what's also sad is these amendments were passed to prevent a thalidomide tragedy, but they actually created an American thalidomide with the folic acid. Yes. Well, let me just share one other piece of information on this book that might interest you. You know, there's a lot of talk about how the pharmaceutical companies are greedy and they charge so much for drugs and on and on. But if you actually look, there's a graph in my book which shows that regulatory costs are tightly correlated with the price that we pay at the pharmacy for our brand name drugs, our new drugs. And if you think about it, that makes perfect sense, right? Because whatever the manufacturer has to pay has to be passed on to the consumer if they go out of business. So it's not really greed, although I have to say these amendments do encourage greed. You know, you've heard several cases of old generic drugs that all of a sudden have this huge price hike. And the reason they do is that the company that began with these drugs, usually as a brand name drug, kept making it after it went generic and sold it at a very reasonable price because that wasn't where their attention was focused. Their attention is focused on new drugs. However, there are now companies that do nothing but go around and see when the regulations knock out all but one generic manufacturer. And when they find a drug that's only made by one manufacturer, they get a license, an exclusive license to market it and hike the price. And that's what's been happening with many of these generics that have gotten very expensive, like Daraprim. Probably heard about that. So this is why, so what's happening is not only do these amendments encourage such greed, but they've really reshaped the pharmaceutical industry. It's very different than when I started in the 70s. And really, the amendments didn't kick in, so to speak, until the 70s because there were a whole lot of lawsuits and concerns that were expressed. So the amendments didn't kick in big time until the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And of course, they've metastasized because they're open-ended. So it's going to get worse every year. It's going to get to the point where we have no new drugs, except the ones that we have to take all of our life and probably aren't too safe. Oh, and I remember I did get a question. I was asked about vaccines, and I didn't answer that question. And I just want to say I haven't studied those as thoroughly as I'd like to have a professional opinion. But, you know, for me, it's like, okay, you're giving our children 36 vaccines in the first few years of their lives. I don't care if you gave it to an adult. You would expect that to actually really, you know, as a professional, I would say you would expect bad things to happen. You just can't give that many vaccines to children because they don't have a well-developed immune system. And even to adults, I think it would be almost criminal to give that many. So that's my professional take on the vaccines. I know there's a lot more information out there, and I haven't studied it in the way I'd like, but I can tell you, you just can't take that many vaccines any more than you can take that many drugs and expect not for there to be interactions and bad things happening. And Kyle's asking me, he's surprised that drug companies can't prevail on First Amendment grounds. That was taken to court. It's one of the things that were taken to court and fought. And the FDA's position is that commercial speech is not protected by the First Amendment, and they have won that. They just kept taking it back to court until they got a court ruling that they liked. And that's how they've done a lot of this. So that's why just repealing the amendments is not enough, because if the FDA can tell you that you can't market the product if you make a claim for it, unless you jump through the regulatory hoops, basically that really is going to limit our prevention, and it's going to limit the information that gets out there to the American public, just like it was limited with folic acid. Oh, okay. So Brian is saying, oh, I'm sorry, I skipped one here. Yes, is there a private, Derek's asking me, is there a private source doing research on supplements and interactions? There are groups that are doing things on that. I think maybe Consumers Lab, I think, might be the one that I've seen the most of that in. And I need to double check that for you, Derek. If you would, if you'd go to my website and send me an email to remind me to check on that for you, I will. And Joanne is, oh, I'm sorry, Brian is saying that, I'll get to you, Joanne, in just a minute. Brian's saying that he heard the drugs are getting into our water supply. Yeah, that is a big issue. And I don't know how dangerous it is at this point in time, but it's going to be a big problem. So what I do is I try to either use distilled water or I use an RO system. And, you know, something to take stuff out. Nothing's perfect other than maybe distillation. But yes, I think it's very important to have clean water. And it's not just drugs that are, you know, that are in the water. There's a lot of chlorine there too. And, you know, there's some evidence that that's not such a good idea to be ingesting either. So I highly recommend another water source. And Joanne's asking me, yes, okay, I'm glad you're bringing this up, Joanne. It's something most people don't realize. So there's this illusion that the FDA does all this testing on drugs, but actually they don't do any testing at all. What they do is they tell the drug companies what types of studies they have to do, and then the drug companies do those studies and submit all of the data. Now, back in the olden days when I was working in the industry, the data actually was so much, and it was before computer type things, that it was actually literally a truckload full of paper that we sent to the FDA when we wanted to get a new drug approved. And the FDA took years to go through it, even though they had collaborated on some of the study designs and things. So what's happening, and what Joanne is pointing out, is that the drug companies themselves are doing the studies. It's not independent third-party testing. And that's something I think would come about if we had certification instead of regulation. Now, the reality is it's not so easy to fudge data because so many people are involved in handling it. So, but it's not, it has happened. There have been instances of it. So, you know, there's that possibility of fraud. And you have to realize that, like back when I started, the pharmaceutical executives were scientists that had been promoted to management. But when these regulations started kicking in big time, and it became obvious that development costs were really going upward, instead of promoting scientists, what they did is they brought in people who were experts in finance or had an MBA, and they basically laid down the law that we couldn't develop any drugs without patents, and, you know, we had to actually estimate the regulatory costs and estimate what we thought the market was going to be. And if those regulatory costs were too high or the market wasn't big enough, we no longer developed the drugs. And it was a much looser system in terms of, you know, trying to make drugs profitable. I mean, the Upjohn Company, for example, was working with these prostaglandins, which were natural substances, but we could get patents on them because the structure was so complex. And so what we were hoping, of course, is that we would sell a lot of prostaglandins. So we had a loss leader. One of our prostaglandins, the first one to market, was something that kept the ductus open in blue babies so that they could be stabilized before surgery. It saved a lot of babies' lives. And of course, down the road, it was also found that it would stimulate labor in women, and so then it started to be used for inducing labor and sometimes abortions. And so this, you know, but the bottom line I was trying to get to on this was that this, you know, the companies were willing to put out loss leaders, things they knew would never make enough money, because they were trying to prime the pump for other products, which I thought was a good way to do it. You know, it was, I thought, a very ethical way to do it. That doesn't happen much anymore because you can't, it's not affordable. Oh, and I didn't finish Joanne's, I didn't answer her last question. She says, how does the process improve safety? Well, it actually doesn't so much. You know, before the amendments were passed, companies decided themselves which animal studies they had to do before taking their product into humans. And then the way they tested them is they gave them to doctors and asked the doctors, okay, give this to your patient, see if it works, and let us know. And if the doctor said, no, it's not working, they usually didn't put it on the market because, you know, the market kind of knew if a drug wasn't working and they wouldn't make money, and they knew that. But it doesn't increase the safety because it's a very, how can I say it? It's a very stilted process. The drugs are no safer than they used to be pre-amendment, and that's what's, you know, that's what I really got excited about when I realized what the amendments were doing to the medical profession, the drug industry, and our ability to prevent disease with supplements and other inexpensive treatments. And I wanted to show that these amendments were deadly. And I think that I have succeeded in doing that. It didn't make anything any safer. The market had already adapted in a 4-year process on average to give us safe and effective drugs, I should mention. The studies that have been done on effectiveness show that drugs today are no more effective than they used to be, except maybe by one study did suggest there might be a 10% benefit. But for that 10% benefit, we are paying 40 times as much at the pharmacy, 40 times. So that's pretty amazing, and that's pretty costly, not just in terms of money, but in terms of lives, as people die waiting and die for lack of innovation in the drug industry. But also, they're dying in numbers I can't really measure because all this information about prevention has been suppressed. And that's, I think that's bigger than anything I've calculated in my book. Lillian's thanking me for my answers on vaccines. Yes, and if there's something in particular you'd like me to look at, I'm happy to do that. Now that I've finished Death by Regulation, I might actually have a little bit of free time. Oh, yes, yes. Oh, Dave's making a very good point. He's saying that he's working in the medical industry, the device industry, which I haven't even talked about devices. It's more of a horror story even for devices, medical devices, than it is for drugs. But I stuck to drugs because that's where the data is. And going from regulation, he says, to certification would mean dismantling internal company bureaucracies, and that's true. One of the biggest hires that and people that companies are looking for are people who know the regulatory climate, because you know that makes or breaks a company. Unfortunately, you know, there are some FDA examiners who, if they don't like you personally, will drag their feet on your application. If a company gets the FDA upset with them, it can literally, quite literally, drive them into bankruptcy. So by just slowing its responses to a company, the FDA can decide which company is first to market. And first to market companies, first to market drugs, are the ones that really make the big bucks. So, this is critical. The FDA can determine who wins and who loses. And they have lots of incentives. I go into the financial incentives in the book for the FDA to make such choices and to marginalize individual physicians who come up with wonderful possibilities for cures. So that's another issue. Yes, Canadians for Liberty was actually asking me about the situations where one person or one company has basically a monopoly on the medication and drives it upward. I talked about this a little bit earlier. I think it might have been before you came on, so I'll just briefly repeat it. What happens is many companies, even after their drug has gone generic, continue to make it as a generic. And usually they don't have a lot of incentive to have a high price because they're working on new drugs, right? That's where their focus is. But the FDA actually cracked down on generic companies about, I want to say 5 to 10 years ago. I don't remember the exact time it started. Anyhow, a lot of generic companies ended up going out of business. And many companies that were making generics of their own drugs that they had first put on the market stopped making them. So now what's happening is there are companies that are formed that do nothing but go around and see when companies drop out of the generic business, which ones are only made by one manufacturer. And then they license that drug from the manufacturer, who really isn't making that much money on it, and jack the price way up. And that's what's happened several times in the US. So, like I said, there's actually companies that do no research, but just go around and pick up these licensing agreements with generic drugs that now only have one manufacturer. And again, the amendments, because they gave the FDA the power to make certain manufacturing standards, have allowed another whole increase in the cost, not just of R&D, research and development, but in the manufacturing and in the advertising. And then because it's become so difficult to get a drug through, the investors are demanding more profit. So all of those things have been inflated by the amendments. Yes, Joanne's asking, is it true that it costs $2.8 million or so to get approval on a new drug? And yes, unfortunately, it does. And the reason it does, in part, I want to acquaint you with two things that go on here that makes this price so high. One is that there are more failures than there are successes. So like about 1 out of 8 or 1 out of 6 drugs that enter human testing ever make it to the market. This means that the drugs that do make it have to make up for all these failures. So that's one of the things that's built into those costs. The other thing is because it takes, now it's about 13 years because there's been some Band-Aids put on the development process. So if it takes 13 years to get a drug to market, there's a cost of capital. And so the capitalized cost is about half of that number. So that's something else to keep in mind, that what the companies are paying for, half of that cost is just to have the money available that long to develop a drug. So that's huge. And these numbers, they're not perfect estimates, but I think the people who are giving the 2.8 figure, that's the DeMasi group at Tufts, I think have done a pretty good job. I think they've come as close as you can come to getting a real number. There's a lot of people out there who say it costs less than that, but if you look carefully at their numbers, they're not accounting for failures. So, of course, since they're not accounting for failures, which are most of the attempts, they're not getting the numbers to come out right. And Joanne, I can't see the last part of your comment. Let me see if I can scroll down. I see that would mean that only, and I don't see the rest of it. I don't seem to be able to scroll down. Let me try again. if you want to type in, okay, here we go. Okay, so yes, this is true. So what you're saying is that only products with patents would be worth developing, and that is the case today. It was not always the case. When development costs were lower before 1962, we did develop drugs without patents. And then, of course, you're talking, I'm assuming, about cannabis, that nobody's going to patent plants that grow on the side of the road. Well, actually, believe it or not, the Patent Office is patenting cannabis strains. Actually, I think I worked on one of the writing up or doing the review of the science for one of the earlier cannabis patents. But what they're doing now is they're using a genetic print of the plant so that certain strains are patentable. The plant itself in general is not patentable, but strains are. And I'll say some few words about the patent process. I have several patents, so I know I've gone through the process. And it's, to a large extent, it's not the kind of intellectual property that libertarians often talk about. It's because the Patent Office really, no matter how hard it tries, can't really distinguish between an old idea and one that's new enough to get a patent. I mean, there's a gradation there. So the whole thing is based on faulty logic, that you can actually determine when one idea ends and another begins, and you can't. So the Patent Office has made some really big mistakes in what they've patented, and then have had to backtrack. So it's really a mess. And if you ever apply for a patent, you'll find that out. Okay, so we're coming up on, okay, we've been at this for almost an hour now, and I really enjoyed interacting with everyone. I hope I've satisfied everyone's questions, but if I haven't, or if you think of something else, please feel free to go to my website at ruwart.com, RUWART.com, and send me an email. And I ask you to send it that way because I get almost 1,000 emails a day. I don't want to miss yours. And the best way to do that is to send it from my website because it gets a special flag. So I want to make sure I tell you about that. And I've got one more question I'll answer, but let me just, before I do, I just want to remind you, please go to deathbyregulation.us and consider purchasing a pre-sale book and getting your $60 worth of free gifts, and help put this on the Amazon bestseller list so that we can do something about it. Because if we don't, we're going to continue to lose years of our lives. Canadians for Liberty is asking me an excellent question. Why do you think people blindly trust the FDA? Well, there's a lot of people who don't, and many of them are people who want to practice prevention, and they've seen how the FDA censors information that could save their lives. So there's a goodly number of people who don't blindly trust the FDA. But there are many who do. And the comment I get the most, even after I tell the folic acid story, is, oh, if we didn't have the amendments, we'd have another thalidomide. And I think part of it is that people want to trust government. Because think about it, if they find out that the FDA is killing them, it's kind of like an abused child finding out that their parent doesn't really love them if they beat them almost to death every so often. It's a tough thing to recognize. As libertarians, we've recognized this and have understood it for a long time. But most people don't, and it's traumatic for them to consider the possibility that the government that's supposed to be protecting them is actually exploiting them or unintentionally even hurting them. And so this is a big problem. However, there's enough people who are sick that have gotten the message. For example, the AIDS patients that I talked about earlier. They just said, we're not going to die waiting. We're going to take matters into our own hands. Cancer patients sued the FDA for the right to take unapproved drugs to save their lives. And they cited the Constitution. That was their case, the Constitution, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And what happened? The courts, first of all, sided with the patients, and then the FDA asked them to reconsider. And they did. And they reversed themselves and said, yeah, the FDA's right. You don't have the right to save your life with an unapproved drug. Recently, Right to Try, which has been passed in, I think, almost 40 states now, and is now being considered by the Congress, has basically resurrected the lawsuit the cancer patients have had. And what it basically says is if you're terminally ill, you are allowed to go directly to the drug company that's making a drug that you think can save your life and negotiate with them for the opportunity to take it. And the biggest argument I've heard against Right to Try is, oh, we have to protect these terminally ill patients from being exploited. And the way I feel about that is, those of you who have a copy of my book, Healing Our World, know exactly how I feel about that. In chapter 6, there's a little cartoon of a person in a wheelchair, and the FDA is saying, well, these drugs won't be approved until you're dead, but at least you'll die safe. Of course, that's ridiculous, right? So anyhow, I guess the message I want to leave you with is that there's becoming a great awareness that the FDA is keeping life-saving drugs from individuals. And this is some of the best news that it's out there. It's not good news that it's happening, but if it's happening, we all need to know about it, right? And so that's been a real game changer, I think. And the Free to Choose Medicine initiative that the Heartland Institute in Chicago is undertaking right now basically is, I'm simplifying it a little bit, but proposes 2 tracks, FDA with approval and a Free to Choose Medicine track without approval. And if you buy a copy of Death by Regulation, you'll get a coupon for $5 off of the new Free to Choose Medicine book, which just came out. And since it's more conservative than what I propose in my book, I think Death by Regulation may make Free to Choose Medicine look good. So maybe that will pass. And I think if it does, it could be enough. It could be enough. Okay, so I think I've answered all your questions. Like I said, if you have more, be sure and contact me at my website. I thank you for coming. It's been a real delight to be able to visit with you today. And maybe we'll do this again. So thank you, and good night.